And hello once again, everybody. I am Moses Leos for Txsportscast.com, and once again, it's another video podcast. On today's podcast, we'll talk about the Texas Longhorns once again, and we'll discuss whether or not Texas has not only just reached a peak, but whether or not the Longhorns are getting ready to slam the panic button altogether. You know, it's interesting when you talk about Texas and what they've done so far this year, and you look at all the accomplishments that they've had. They've had a great start to the year. They've at least to this point so far, they've been able to stay on top of the Big 12. They haven't really reached any significant adverse points in the season. That has changed completely. All of a sudden, this last third of the season, the Longhorns have not only just hit that adverse part of a season, the Longhorns are all together. Texas is just struggling, for the most part, just having a bad time. And they've lost two straight ball games. Their first loss, I should say, in the two-game losing streak, they lost to Colorado in Boulder. That was on Saturday. That was a 91-89 game where Texas just struggled all day long, and they weren't able to do very much against the Colorado Buffaloes, who were unranked. And then, of course, on Monday night, Texas at home against Kansas State, a place in the Erwin Center, I should say, where they haven't lost all year long in conference play. Texas loses, and they don't just lose, they lose rather convincingly, 75-70 against the Kansas State team, which was likewise not ranked. So now, when you look at Texas, a team that had started out the year so well, they were doing so great. At one point, they were 23-4 at one point. They were doing well, and now all of a sudden, Texas is struggling. They've hit a wall, and it's going to be very interesting to see what Texas can do from this point. But let's kind of backtrack. Let's talk about Texas in the past tense, and let's talk about what they've done against Colorado and Kansas State, what some of the fallout was from those two games, and what the problems were. The biggest problem I saw from both games, and what might be a disturbing trend for Texas going into the postseason now, the fact that Texas has become a very soft team on the inside part of the court. Texas is no longer playing strong on the inside, in the paint, if you will, inside the painted area of the basketball court. They're playing very soft, very not necessarily lethargic, but they're just not playing crisply as they were in the first half, even the last couple of games. Against Colorado and Kansas State, Texas played poor in the paint. They couldn't shoot well, and defensively, Texas was just giving up way too many easy jumpers and easy shots underneath. Added to the fact that Texas was giving up way too many second chance opportunities at key points in the ball game, of which I should say in both the Colorado and the Kansas State game, key points where they just couldn't get a rebound to save their lives. Well, let's look at Colorado first. In that Colorado game, I think a good stat that kind of wraps that whole point up, the rebounding against Colorado. Texas, early on in the season, Texas was out-rebounding people. They were out-rebounding them by 10 or more rebounds. Texas was just playing so well against a lot of teams of which were really good. Kansas, Michigan State, even though Michigan State's struggling, they did a good job of out-rebounding them. They out-rebounded Missouri, Texas A&M. Both times they beat Texas A&M. Against Colorado, though, Texas was out-rebounded 40-36 in that ball game. 40-36. That's poor. And all those rebounds for Colorado, the 40 rebounds for Colorado, 32 of those rebounds were on the defensive side. Only 8 offensive rebounds. Texas just could not get any rebounds at all when they shot the ball. Texas was just not able to get themselves second chance opportunities off their misses. It was just a poor night for Texas last Saturday, where they were not playing well in the inside. They had no inside presence, and for those who watch basketball a lot, if you don't have an inside presence, you're not going to win too many ball games. And so for Texas, and especially with Texas, because the Longhorns are not necessarily a three-point shooting team. Jordan Hamilton's very good at shooting the three, but you can't count on Hamilton to hit every night, and that's the thing. Texas is dependent on playing that strongly on the inside. The fact that they haven't is troubling, I think, for a lot of Texas fans right now. The fact that Texas just can't play very strong right now. Now, granted, I guess when you look at the Kansas State game, that might be a little bit different because Colorado, as good as they are, they're a little bit smaller than what Texas was. They were not quite as big as the Longhorns, which is why it was a shock that Texas lost that game, especially with how they lost it, getting beaten in the paint. Against Kansas State, though, it's a little bit different because Frank Martin's team, the coach for Kansas State, his team is big. They have a couple of big guys in the middle, I should say. Jordan Henriquez Roberts, he's one of their big centers for Kansas State. He was just a very good player, a pivotal player in the ballgame. 8 rebounds for him in the ballgame. He was able to have his presence, and he was able to disrupt Tristan Thompson and Corey Joseph underneath defensively to where they couldn't have an inside presence, and they were forced to start shooting jump shots. And for Tristan Thompson and Corey Joseph, and even for a lot of the other players, shooting jump shots is not their forte. It isn't. It isn't their game. Texas's game, as I mentioned, it's all on the inside, and that is huge that a team like Kansas State could stop Texas that much. And you got to credit Kansas State and Colorado. I think that's kind of lost in this mix here. I think a lot of people are going to talk about how Texas is failing, how Texas is playing poorly. Let's kind of remind ourselves how good these teams are. Colorado's not terrible. Colorado's pretty darn good. They played a very good season this year. They've had a pretty good season this year. They've had some ups and downs, but they're not a terrible team. They're 18-11. They're 500 in Big 12 play, but they're not necessarily bad. And Kansas State likewise. Kansas State was ranked for a good time, or I should say, Kansas State struggled at the start of the year, but they've rebounded well. They've won 5 straight games going into Monday night's contest in the Irwin Center. So the thing is it's not necessarily Texas is playing poorly, but it's not helping that Texas is playing as bad as they have been in the last 2 games. And I think the second thing I think of which a lot of people are finding troubling in terms of Texas's play, outside of the fact that Texas is not playing strong on the inside, is the fact that Texas has had 2 straight games, Colorado and Kansas State, and going back to last weekend against Nebraska, Texas has had 3 games, I should say, 3 out of the last 4, where the second half they come out lethargic, they come out uninspired, and they get torched. They were winning, Texas was winning at halftime 33-31, but Kansas State just started off the second half on a roll, and Texas couldn't get themselves a start. In fact, I think it was the first 7 minutes of the second half in the Kansas State game, Texas just couldn't hit a shot they just couldn't hit the broadside of the barn. They were just unable to shoot the ball well. So that's a big troubling sign for a Longhorn fan. The fact that Texas just can't get it done in the second half. Now, obviously, that begs the question. Is it time to slam the panic button in Austin? Not yet. Not yet. Not quite yet. But another game like this against Baylor, in Baylor, if Texas plays the way that they have in the last 2 games, yes, it will be time to slam the panic button, because it will. If Texas loses on Saturday against Baylor in Baylor, if they lose that game, that would be 3 straight losses going into the Big 12 tournament, of which a lot of people 2 weeks ago probably would have said, "Oh, it doesn't mean much for Texas right now. They'll be a locked number 1 seed for sure." All of a sudden now, if Texas loses to Baylor, now Texas not only has to fight for decent positioning in the tournament in the Big 12, in the NCAA tournament, in the Big 12 tournament, they could very well be playing for their tournament lives, because no team that goes into the NCAAs losing 4 straight games, and this is assuming Texas loses to Baylor and their first round tournament game, if they can't pull themselves out of this slump that they're in, 4 straight losses going into the NCAAs, that just spells disaster. And it would be a huge disappointment if Texas were to go into the NCAAs losing 4 straight, if they were to lose 4 straight. I mean, it's just something of which I think a lot of people would be very surprised and very shocked with. I know I would be shocked if that were to happen. Luckily for Texas, though, these are 2 games of which they can try to work themselves back into a better position, play more physically, more strongly, and they can get themselves back into a better position for the NCAAs. Now, I will say, I think the number 1 seed is no longer a lock. In fact, I don't even think Texas will be getting a number 1 seed, period. Is that terrible? No, by no means. It's not the end of the world for a lot of people who think so, that Texas losing a number 1 seed is the end of the world, because it isn't. It's okay for Texas to be a number 2 or a number 3 seed. It gives them some room to grow, but that's assuming Texas can pull themselves out of this big funk that they have put themselves in these last 3 out of their 4 losses that they've had in this stretch here in the last month. It's all dependent on whether or not Texas can pull themselves out of it. So it's not time to slam the panic button yet. Not yet. But we're getting pretty close to that point. It's a troubling sign for Texas fans, but luckily there's still one more game in the regular season, and then of course the Big 12 tournament. And who knows, if Texas can pull themselves out of this, they could win a Big 12 championship in the tournament. We'll have to wait and see. But for Texas right now, they lost the game against Kansas State 75-70. They dropped it on Monday night. So now Texas is now second in the Big 12. Texas is now second in the Big 12. The Longhorns are now, or I should say the Longhorns have lost now the first place position to Kansas. Bit of a shock. It's a big shock actually for a lot of people right now. But let's see what Texas can do. The Longhorns still have at least 2 more games in the regular season.